Helima, how is Russia's war on Ukraine changing this global energy picture? We've been hearing most recently that Russia's oil output has been falling. How do you interpret that?
I mean, clearly we have significant sanctions that have been placed on Russia. We've not yet seen major importers of Russian oil and gas implement embargoes. We've had countries that don't take significant quantities, like the United States, like Canada, announcing embargoes. But we have seen Russian oil exports decline because companies, shipping firms, trading houses, banks are walking away from doing business with Russia. So we are starting to see declines in Russian energy exports. Some of those volumes, though, are going into India, which has basically ramped up Russian imports. But we anticipate, and we think this is very important for people to pay attention to, is that Europe will likely move towards reducing Russian imports, either through an outright EU ban on oil, potentially followed by gas at a later date, or you'll have major importers like Germany make decisions to start walking back from their Russian oil imports. And that could leave a much more significant hole in the market as Russia struggles to find buyers. And that we think will put upward pressure on prices.
Are you seeing an energy standoff of sorts? Do you think that there's an intentional withholding of supplies that's happening here?
Well, I think what Russia right now is playing the energy blackmail card, essentially, saying, look, you know what? Do you want to try to reduce your imports from Russia? Where else are you going to get supplies? I mean, I think that is some of the reticence that we're seeing from countries like Germany, essentially saying that we cannot economically afford to break with Russia right now. And so what we're not seeing yet is Russia, at least overtly, weaponizing their energy exports by withholding supply. They're more making public statements saying, Western nations, you're worried about inflation? Well, if you put certain sanctions in place, you're going to see much higher commodity prices across the board. So they're basically raising the specter of much higher commodity prices, higher inflation levels, and asking the West, is this what they're prepared to endure in defense of Ukraine?
You just touched on it a short time ago. The US and the UK decided not to take Russia's oil. The EU, not so much in that position. And it might be easier to replace oil, but maybe not so much natural gas. Talk to us about the challenges that are happening in Europe and around the world.
I mean, even with oil, Russia sends about half of their exports to Europe, just over 2 million barrels a day. Yes, there's alternative sources of supply, but there's not a lot out there. When we think about OPEC, we think OPEC maybe has 2 to 2.4 million barrels a day in terms of what they can bring on in 30 days and keep on for 90, the definition of spare capacity. So yes, there's alternative oil out there, but to backfill all of Russian oil exports to Europe, that's still a tall order. Now, there are strategic stockpiles that, IEA member countries have. We've had this big release announced by the United States and by other IEA countries. When you pivot to natural gas, however, there's no SPR for natural gas. There is not a lot of additional supply out there. Yes, we've had some conversations where we've heard that Algeria is going to be providing more gas into Europe. We're having discussions about, more US LNG cargoes potentially moving into Europe. But to replace all of the Russian exports into Europe is very, very challenging when we think about gas. And I was just in Qatar a couple of weeks ago, and Qatar is one of the countries that we've looked to provide more LNG cargoes to Europe. And yes, we have basically seen them say that they're going to not divert the supplies that are already going into Europe as we look out over next year. The Qatari officials were saying to us, though, on the sidelines of the Doha Forum, there simply is not a lot of additional supplies out there. And so nations are going to have to think very carefully about how much economic pain a country like Germany could endure if they really were to try to halt all Russian gas imports.
When you think about alternative oil sources, you had mentioned OPEC, of course. How does Saudi Arabia, Iran, Venezuela fit into this equation?
This is a great question. And we were just in Saudi Arabia as well. And the Saudis have said two things. First, before they move outside the OPEC framework, and the Saudis, as part of OPEC, are collectively as a group, they're putting 400,000 barrels a day a month on the market, new incremental volumes. Now, OPEC has struggled at times to even reach that 400,000. But the Saudis have said, if you want us to basically work outside this arrangement, we want a whole new security partnership with the United States. That is not an easy ask of the United States, given some of the issues in the US-Saudi bilateral relationship. So not a quick fix in terms of resetting the US-Saudi relationship. The second issue that the Saudis have raised about working outside this OPEC easing formula is they say, we don't have that much spare capacity out there. If we put it on the market now, and we have a situation where there are more serious energy sanctions put on Russia, where are the additional volumes going to come from? And they point to the situation in the run-up to the financial crisis in 2007, when OPEC was actually increasing production, and then traders focused on the shortage of spare capacity. And prices actually continued to rise as OPEC was putting more volumes on the market, as people said, there's not a lot of additional volumes out there to deal with any disruption. And the Saudis are saying the same situation could happen now. And they actually looked at what's happened with the SPR release that was announced by the United States. 180, million barrels. That's a very, very large release, an additional million barrels a day for 6 months. But once we get past those 6 months, the United States does not have a lot of additional barrels they can bring on the market. And so from the Saudi standpoint, they would believe that putting barrels on too soon could leave you in a very precarious situation if this is a prolonged conflict involving Russia and Ukraine, and if you have much larger losses of Russian exports due to sanctions.
Now, we saw that oil prices were already headed for historic highs prior to Russia's war in Ukraine, February 24th. Where do you see prices headed now? How does this change the picture now?
I think there are a couple X factors that we really need to think about. I mean, we thought this was already a tight market before you had the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We were already thinking about triple-digit oil prices over the summer. But the question is, how do we retest highs that we saw earlier this year? How do you move to a much higher price point that's sort of 185 to 200? I think it depends on how this war is waged. I mean, real questions about is Europe going to essentially embargo Russian oil? I think that is a catalyst to retesting earlier highs in this market. But how we go materially beyond what we've already seen in terms of prices, I would say would be a secondary sanction. And a secondary sanction would essentially say to all foreign purchasers of Russian oil, you have to choose between doing business with Russia and doing business with the United States. That's essentially what we did to Iran. And that's how we saw such large reductions in Iranian oil exports, as countries like India and China even had to make decisions to reduce their imports of Iranian oil. As I mentioned earlier, we've seen India essentially back up the truck with a $30 a barrel discount on Russian oil. They have ramped up their imports. And so I do think you would actually need to see a secondary sanction placed on Russian oil exports, sanctions on ensuring Russian cargoes, shipping Russian cargoes done by the United States to get companies like Reliance in India to stop taking discounted Russian barrels. If that were to happen, and essentially Russia would be largely removed from the oil export market, I think that's when you're talking about prices that are much higher than what we saw earlier this year. And then that brings up the question of recession, demand destruction, but the path to that sort of 185, 200 level, I think comes from secondary sanctions or a terrible situation were this crisis to move beyond Ukraine and actually involve NATO countries. Again, I think that's the path to getting to that sort of 185, 200 mark that some analysts have already thrown out there.